Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Your audio should be working. Can you all hear me? Okay, thank you. Please stay muted.
I want to welcome everybody here. I want to say that it's an honor and a privilege to have people here from all around the world and to be able to celebrate this amazing moment together, celebrate our finishing Masechet Shabbat together here today. The Siyum is sponsored in memory of Rabbi Adin Eben Yisrael Steinsaltz, Zatzal, a true giant in Torah learning and a leading educator of our generation. He really worked hard to make the Talmud accessible to all with his amazing work of Talmud, and due to him, we're all here together to be able to celebrate. Also by Rosalind Jaffe, in honor of the 7th yahrzeit of her wonderful father, Mickey Mulrad, Alav Shalom, Moshe Yaakov ben David. He followed in Hashem's ways with his kindness, chesed, and love for Yiddishkeit and learning. He had great respect for Talmidei Chachamim and would be so proud of all the women learning Torah today. Rabbi Steinsaltz was often quoted as saying that when one learns the Bible, as it was written by prophets, you somehow become in your mind like a little prophet, one who has complete, unlimited knowledge. However, learning Talmud is connected to dialectic, he said, and therefore he proposed stressing more learning of Talmud in curriculum in schools in order to teach people how to engage in conversation, in dialogue, in a respectful manner. In a similar vein, Amos Oz in his book, Shalom Lakanaim, Dear Zealot, writes about the word teku. If you're familiar with the word teku, it means take home. It should stand, which means that we don't actually have a resolution to it. And some people explain it means tishbi yitaretz kushiyot u'ba'ayot, which means that one day Eliyahu Hanavi will come and he'll give us the answer, which basically means that we end up having an unresolved situation. So he explains in this book that it's a word that can't be translated into any other language. There is no such word in any other language other than Aramaic. The meaning, he says, is lo noa. It's okay. We can each stand with our disagreement between us. We don't always have to have everything resolved. We can leave things open. Maybe there's even a benefit, he says, to having things left open, as long as we argue with respect. So for those of you who are new to Gemara, and those of you who've been learning for years, at this point, you probably all know that this is the beauty of the Talmud. The ability to engage in conversation of texts that have been discussed for many, many years, and learn about debates that most of the time are held in a respectful manner. For some of you, it may be difficult that issues remain unresolved. You want a final answer. But it's precisely that which is what allows our religion to continue to develop and actually be sustained for all these years. I want to thank all of you who've come to the Siyum to learn together. I want to thank those who've joined Hadran's Circle of Friends and helped support what we're doing. Those who have joined and are active in Hadran communities. I know the last number of days, there's been a lot of new people who have joined communities, and I want to invite you to share who you are with your group, to be involved, to be active, to share thoughts about the Daf. The more we engage people in the communities, the more we continue the dialogue and the conversation. That's so important to our learning. We have lots of content now on the website, both in Hebrew and in English. We have daily content from Talking Talmud, and we're very proud to be able to host them today, and in Yardena who are with us. And we have weekly content, both in English and Hebrew. And I invite all of you, if you read something you like, share it around, put it up on Facebook, on Instagram, share it with friends. Spread your love of learning. You're all here because you love to learn. Spread it with others, and let's increase the amount of people engaged in this dialogue. Lastly, I just want to say Mazal Tov to everybody here. I know it has not been an easy few months for anybody. I recently had a conversation with a friend, and we were saying how everybody is dealing with Corona in their own way. Everybody has, it kind of threw at each of us our own unique challenges. And in fact, I've seen a lot of people make reference to this, that the whole thing started basically when we started Masechet Shabbat. And if we look at our journey through Masechet Shabbat, it's been with that in the background or in the front ground. And I want to just say that particularly because of that, all those of you who are finishing, I want to say congratulations. It's an amazing accomplishment. And if you haven't yet finished, or you're not even planning to finish, you should feel good about every daf that you learn, because everything that you learn is important. And even if you don't finish the goal of Daf Yomi, even though it seems like the goal is to finish, it's really to be engaged in the learning. And that's the most important part. With that, we're going to start the learning the last daf together. And I just want to add that our learning should be for Refuah Shlema for two people, two very special people in our community. One is, it's a husband and wife, and the wife tomorrow morning is donating a kidney to her husband. So Refuah Shlema for Elchanan David ben Yatzarut and Tzipora bat Charna. It may all go well tomorrow. We're going to start on Daf Kuf Nun Zayin from the Mishnah, Mefirim Nidarim b'Shabbat v'Nishalim l'Nidarim shehem l'Tzorech HaShabbat. Before we start, I want to explain what Mefirim Nidarim are and what Nishalim l'Nidarim are. Mefirim Nidarim is that a husband can cancel the vows of his wife, or a father can cancel the vows of her daughter. Now you might think, what's that all about? And why, as a woman, she makes a vow, her husband can just come along and cancel it, or her father can just come along and cancel it. And it seems a little bit strange, certainly for our modern eyes. Well, there was a case in the Supreme Court that I want to bring up in the United States called Bradwell versus the state of Illinois, which was in 1872. There was a woman who wanted to become a lawyer. And this was before women who really had become lawyers. And the state, in some places, women were allowed to be lawyers, and other places not. And in the state of Chicago, they would not allow Mrs. Bradwell to be a lawyer. And the decision of the Supreme Court was to uphold the state of Chicago, to deny her from getting a license to practice law. Now, you might say, why is that, right? You might say, okay, so one of the reasons they gave was that, and I'll quote it from there, as a married woman, she would be bound neither by her express contracts nor by those implied contracts, which is the policy of law to create between attorney and client. And the reason they were concerned that she wouldn't be able to uphold her contracts were because husbands could cancel the contracts of their wives. And therefore, so now we're talking late 1800s, and in the United States, women also, their contracts, any contract of law that they made was able to be canceled by their husband. They even asked, what about single women? So why can't single women be lawyers? To, of course, the answer given was, I'm sorry, I said the state of Chicago. I meant the state of Illinois, my mistake. Thank you for correcting me. But the issue was that I was reading something that I took offline. It said state of Chicago. Anyway, the reason they say is that the norm is for women to get married, and women should be married, and therefore we're not going to create a law for exceptions to the rule that we don't actually believe should be. So if you think that in the Gemara way back when, this seems a little bit different than our reality, you can see that even in the United States in the late 1800s, this was the case. So when we talk about husband being able to cancel his wife's vows, it actually makes sense in the context not only of way back then, but even 150 years ago. So with that, we'll get started with our Mishnah. Now, if you notice, there's a little bit of lack of parallelism here. It says that one can nullify vows on Shabbat, and they can nishalim l'nidarim shehem litzorech haShabbat. What does that mean? This is something else. This is not a father or a husband nullifying his wife's vows. This is somebody takes a vow and then they regret that they took a vow. So they go to a Talmid Chacham or a Chacham, a wise man, someone who can cancel their vow, and that person is allowed to cancel their vows. You can go in front of a Beit Din, a court. Nowadays, we do this on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and Kol Nidrei, our Tefillah, is based on that. So a husband or a father can nullify a vow on Shabbat of his wife or his daughter. And Nishalim l'nidarim, one can go to a Chacham on Shabbat and say, I want to cancel my vow if it's litzorech haShabbat. Like, for example, somebody says, I don't want to eat. I'm going to vow that I'm not going to eat. And then, of course, it's Shabbat and they want to eat. So they say, okay, so litzorech Shabbat, because you want to eat on Shabbat, we'll allow it. Now, notice that the words litzorech haShabbat didn't appear in the first section. The first section just said you could do this on Shabbat. It doesn't sound like it's limited in any way. The next thing the Mishnah talks about seems totally unconnected. You can put a glass or you can any kind of stopper in a window to block the window. You can measure a cloth. If you remember, we've learned about purity and impurity laws, and it has to be a certain measurement in order for it to become impure. It has to be a certain minimum measurement. And you can measure a mikvah on Shabbat to be able to purify things. So now we're going to hear about a maaseh that happened in the time of Rabbi Tzadok and in the time of Abba Shaul ben Bitnit. They closed up a window with a shard, with not with a shard, with a utensil, with an earthenware utensil. They took a shard and they tied it. We're going to see exactly what this is. It's going to be very unclear mission until we get to the Gemara. They took a shard and they tied it with a reed. Now, remember, we learned tying is not permissible on Shabbat. They wanted to know if the roof had a hole that was the size of a tefach. We're going to have to understand what's going on. We don't really understand the story yet. We'll have to wait till we get to the Gemara. And from this story, whether or not it had it or whether it did or didn't. And from their action, what do we learn? That you can close up a window, you can measure, and because they measured at the size of a tefach, and you can tie on Shabbat. This seems to be things you're not generally allowed to do, so we're going to have to understand what's going on. Before we get to this, okay, you can start looking at your sheet. The sheet has all this charted out. We're now going to have a question on the first part of the Mishnah. And then we're going to have two versions of this question. Ibayalu. So the Gemara asks, Hafara ben litzorech uben shelo litzorech. V'she'ela litzorech in shelo litzorech lo. When we said, and the first thing they're going to question is exactly what we said, that there's a problem with the structure here. The structure seems to say you can do hafarat nidarim, nullifying vows of your wife or your daughter on Shabbat, without saying litzorech Shabbat, for the purpose of Shabbat. And then it says nishalim lenidarim shehen litzorech haShabbat. You can only cancel your vow to go to an expert who can cancel vows if it's for the purposes of Shabbat. So now they want to know, hafara, can one cancel a vow of his wife or his daughter? Bein litzorech, bein shelo litzorech, whether it's for the purposes of Shabbat or whether it's not. V'she'ela litzorech in, shelo litzorech lo. But she'ela, but to go to a chacham and ask to repeal to cancel your vow, that is only if it's for the purpose of Shabbat. Umishum hachi kapaginu me'adade. Now the Gemara says, and the reason why that would be logical would be, look at the structure of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat, which means we're kind of taking a break here. And then it says, minishalim l'nidarim shehen l'tzorech haShabbat. If we wanted to say the rules are the same for both, we would have put the word b'Shabbat at the end. We would have said, mifirim nidarim, we can nullify vows, and we can dissolve vows. Shehen l'tzorech haShabbat b'Shabbat. And then that would have been very clear. But since it doesn't say that, it seems to imply that hafara would be either which way, and she'ela would be only for the purposes of Shabbat. And that's why kabaginu me'adade, that's why they were separated in the Mishnah. O Dilma, you can see how much they learn from the wording of the Mishnah. O Dilma, or perhaps hafara nami litzorech in shelo litzorech lo. Maybe hafara, maybe nullifying vows is also only for the purposes of Shabbat. And now obviously he's going to have to explain, well, then why did they split the Mishnah? They wanted to make it clear that you understood that these are two different things. One is hafara, one is hashalat. They're not the same, even though you might think to confuse them. One can be done only in front of a court, that's the she'ela, and hafara can be done by any man for his wife or his daughter. So that's the question. Let's see the answer. Tashma, and this is going to be the same in both. The question is going to be different. The answer is going to be the same. Tashma, the Tanezuta, the Bei Rav Papa, they had a braita in the house of Rav Papa. Mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat litzorech Shabbat. So what do you see here? One can nullify vows on Shabbat for the purpose of Shabbat. Litzorech Shabbat in, shelo litzorech Shabbat lo. So you see here, it's very clear, only for the purposes of Shabbat. Lishna achrina, now there's a different way to explain this. Ibayalehu, so now of course the way we're going to read the Mishnah is mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat and nishalim nidarim shem litzorech haShabbat. The only way one can do this is if one's doing it for the purposes of Shabbat. And this is actually going to lead us to the next story, because the next story is also something where they allowed something for the purposes of Shabbat. But the Lishna achrina has the question a little bit differently. And it gets at a different issue that we didn't get raised about, it teaches us something about nullifying vows. Ibayalu. So the question was asked differently now. Litzorech, again, many times we've seen that there's different versions of the same debate. It's just a matter of how exactly did the question come about? How was the debate? Here's a matter of what the question was. The answer, as I said, will be the same. Ibayalu. Litzorech atravayu katane, shelo litzorech lo, alma hafarat nidarim me'ed la'ed. Do we say that litzorech refers to both? That when it says shehem litzorech haShabbat, it's referring both to the first part and to the second part. In which case you would say, but if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat, then you can't. And what could one infer from that? Okay, before we move on, I'm just going to clarify something. If I take a vow and I want to cancel that vow and I want to go to a chacham, I can go anytime I want. I make the vow. If I want to go 2 weeks later, I can go cancel it. But now we're going to learn that there was a limitation. And this is interesting in terms of thinking. If I make a vow, my husband can cancel it or my father can cancel it. By the way, it's father until you have a husband. They only get a certain time frame in which they can do it. It's not endless. What the idea is that when they hear the neder, and it comes from the Torah, it says, im shama, I don't remember the verse exactly, but it says when he hears, then he has only a certain amount of time that he can cancel it. We don't let him do it forever. So now they're going to say, if you say that it could be either litzorech or it's if it could be only Litzorech Shabbat, what does that infer? That the time he has would be more than the day of Shabbat. Assuming he hears on Shabbat, it means that it must be he has time to do it after. Otherwise, there would be no issue of saying that it's Shalol Litzorech, he can't cancel it. Because if you can't cancel it Shalol Litzorech, and then you won't be able to cancel it ever if there's a time limit. So let's see what the time limit is. Therefore, they're going to say, we're going to learn that there's a debate. One opinion says you only get till nightfall of that day. So assuming she takes the neder on Shabbat, and we say, well, if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat, we don't let him nullify it. Then what happens? If he can't nullify it tomorrow, then there's no such thing as not Litzorech Shabbat. It's always going to be Litzorech Shabbat. And therefore, they say it must be you have 24 hours to nullify. So therefore, let's say he hears Shabbat morning, he has till Sunday morning. And that's what we're talking about here, that it's only Litzorech Shabbat. And then if not, well, he could do it tomorrow. O Dilma, or perhaps Ki Katani Litzorech Ashelahu de Katani. When it says Litzorech, maybe it's only referring to the second case of dissolving the vow with a Chacham. But Ashelahu de Katani aval haparat nedarim afilu shelo Litzorech. But haparat nedarim can be done, as it looks like the pshat of the Mishnah. There's no limit on it. Now, why? There's no. It doesn't matter whether it's Litzorech or Shelo Litzorech, whether it's something that affects her, let's say eating on Shabbat, or it doesn't affect her Shabbat. So therefore, what it must be, if we say it's that reading, then we can infer what this reading is saying is basically, we want to learn something from this Mishnah about hafarat nedarim in general. And therefore, we can derive that what? Alma hafarat nedarim kol hayom. You must be allowed to have it all day long. So again, the Gemara says, Tashma, this is the same as the first version. Let's learn it from this source. Titane Rav Zuta debe Rav Papi mifirin nedarim b'Shabbat litzorech haShabbat. By the way, the first time it was Rav Papa, here it's Rav Papi. You can do it litzorech haShabbat, which seems to infer litzorech haShabbat in shelo litzorech haShabbat lo alma. Therefore, what can one derive from here? Haparat nedarim me'et lei. You have 24 hours. Rav Ashi, but Rav Ashi says, wait a minute. According to the Mishnah says haparat nedarim kol hayom, and this has a kula and a chumrah. What is the kula and the chumrah? Ketzad. Here it doesn't exactly mean kula and chumrah the way we usually. It has something stringent, something lenient. What it means is could be something that works to your advantage, and it could be something that maybe doesn't always work to your advantage. So what does that mean? This is kind of obvious. If you only have till nightfall, it kind of depends on when you heard about the vow. So, Ketzad, Nadra Lele Shabbat, here they actually talk about the moment she took the vow. Nadra, if she took the vow, Lele Shabbat, Friday night, Mefer Lele Shabbat, V'yom Shabbat, Ad Shetechshach, he basically has till nightfall of the next day. It's almost 24 hours. Nadra im chashecha, but what if she took the neder just before nightfall on Shabbat afternoon? Mefer ad shelo techshach. He has a very small window in which he can. So that's what we mean, lahakel ulahachmir. And what do you see from here? This goes against the conclusion we just came to. We just came to the conclusion that he has 24 hours. But this Mishnah seems to imply that he only has till nightfall. So what's the obvious answer the Gemara is going to say? Tanaihi, it must be a machloket tanaim. Okay, there's a Tanaitic debate about this. So anytime we say there's a Tana that seems to contradict, we say, oh, there's another Tana that says this, and that kind of resolves it for us. Titania says in the following Braita, haparat nedarim kol hayom, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon amru me'ed le'ed. So here you see, it's a subject of debate. Going back to what I mentioned before about there constantly being debates, here we have a debate about the topic. Nishalim le'nidarim. Now they have one final question about this. Ibayalehu. Kishalo hayalo pnai, o dilma afilo hayalo pnai. We've come across this before. What if there's something you could have done before and you didn't take care of it? Right? We all know Friday we get very busy and there's lots of things that we don't end up taking care of. Shabbat comes in, all of a sudden you remember all these things you don't take care of. Are you allowed to do something that in general would be permitted, but you could have done it before and you didn't? So is that allowed? So now they say, Tashma, let's learn from here. Does kikule Rabbanan leRav Zutra bered Rav Zera v'sharu nidre. The rabbis took Rav Zutra, the son of Rabbi Zera, and they martyred his neder on Shabbat. Even though it was a situation where there was time, he did have an opportunity to do it the day before. By the way, whenever they say had the opportunity, I always wonder, what does it really mean had the opportunity? Like if you look at my Friday, and my Friday is busy and I don't have a lot of time and I didn't get to everything, does that mean I had the time because I didn't make the time, right? We all know you don't really think you have the time, but somehow you could have really made the time. Or does it mean that you actually had some free time and you didn't do it? So it's a very good question about what this means. Don't have an answer for it, but it's something to think about. So anyway, they say they let him get rid of his neder, nullify it, even though he did have time to do it previously, and there they have. Now we're going to get to this strange thing. He's now going to explain to us what exactly happened here. A few different interpretations, but let's assume there was an alley, a little passageway between two houses. V'tuma haytasham. Now, it wasn't exactly tuma. It was someone was about to die. Now, what happens if someone's about to die? Okay, we end with tuma and tara. We've discussed this a lot in the Masechet tuma and tara, although we're not going to actually end on it. We're close to ending on it. V'gigit stuka munachat al gaban. There was a little bit of a roof over this area, and the person was under the roof in between these two houses, and the person was about to die. Now, there's a window leading to the houses. If a person were to die under there and there's a roof, this is what we call tumah made in an ohel. He's under a cover. The tumah spreads through the whole space in the alley, and then it also goes through windows. Now you see why they wanted to stop up the window, because before the person died, they wanted to make sure, right, what happens if the tumah goes in the house, all the utensils in the house become tameh. So they wanted to basically, they wanted to stop the tumah from going. So what they do, they quickly put a vessel in the window to block the tumah from going in. Now, there's another law. If there was a hole apparently in the roofing. So if they wanted to measure if it was a tefach, it's a bit of a debate about whether the whole body had to be under the tefach or part of the body, but let's assume the body was under the space. And then if it was a tefach, then we'd say that the tumah goes straight up through the hole, in which case there's no ohel, in which case it won't go through the windows and it won't go into the houses and it won't be a problem at all. So they wanted to know if there was a tefach and if there would be any problem of tumah at all, or the tumah would just go straight up and it wouldn't be a problem. So because of that, they basically allowed them to tie with a reed. Now, why is a reed okay? Because it's not a kesher shel kayama. It doesn't last. So because of that, they allow it to be tied. They allowed them to tie it with a reed. And what they do, they wanted to tie it to the roof to measure. First they measured exactly a tefach. Then, which is also a problem. Why is measuring a problem? Measuring is a problem on Shabbat because it's like mekach umemkar. So if you remember with mekach umemkar, it's doing business on Shabbat, and measuring is something they generally do in business dealings. So measuring is generally a problem, but we're going to learn now that you can allow it for the purposes of a mitzvah. They call this a mitzvah. Why is it a mitzvah? Because you're saving items from becoming tameh or from becoming impure. Right, and from there they learned that you can do pokakin, you can put something in a window. We already learned that. That's because it's like remember if it's hanging from the window, we already learned this whole section. And modidim, you measure, and koshlim, and you can tie b'Shabbat. This presumably means that you did it for the purposes of a mitzvah. Now that they're really quoting this line here, not because it's ending the story, because they figured you already know that, but they're quoting it as the lead into the last story of the Gemara. Interestingly, the Gemara ends with the story. It doesn't always end with the story, but in this Masechet it does. Ula ikla lebe Reish Galuta. Ula comes to the house of the Reish Galuta. He's the exilarch. We've seen this in many situations. The people come to his house. There's always big feasts. There's a lot of wealth. He's a very wealthy person. They go to the Reish Galuta's house. Chazi leRabba bar Rav Huna diyativ ba'avna demaya. He sees Rabba bar Rav Huna, a very strange scene. He sees him sitting in a tub of water. Scene gets a little stranger. V'kam mashechle, and he's measuring the water in the tub. It's strange. Why is he doing this on Shabbat? Why is he doing this in the house of the Reish Galuta? Why is Ula watching him while he's in this tub of water? Amar le, imor da amre rabbanan medida de mitzvah. To love mitzvah mi amor. Ula says to him, "What are you doing? The rabbis allow measuring, but they only allow measuring for the purposes of a mitzvah. You're just sitting in this tub of water. You're not doing any mitzvah. Why are you measuring the water?" Amar le, and here's the fascinating to me that the Masechet ends with these words: Mitasek be'alma ana. I'm just playing around in the water with the measuring stick. Not really. I'm not measuring for the sake of measuring. I'm just measuring to keep myself busy. Somebody said that I read a commentary that said that since you're not allowed to learn Torah, so he needed to focus his attention on something while he was in the bath so that he could, not think of Torah while he was there. Anyway, first of all, why is it interesting? Mitasek, we've talked about this many times about the idea of intention, and we're going to hear later about the idea of intention. Yafit's going to talk about it. But I wanted to really talk about a few themes that come up at the end of this Masechet. So the first theme I wanted to discuss is the rich-poor theme. We started our Masechet with the idea of the Ani and the Balabayit, if you remember. They were standing, right? The Ani is outside, the Balabayit's inside, and they want to give. And in fact, the Meiri says there that why did the Mishnah start with this? Because they wanted to teach you that even for the sake of a mitzvah, you can't desecrate Shabbat, right? You can't give them, you might think, oh, maybe I could give something to a poor person, even though it's Shabbat. And no, Shabbat is more important. On the other hand, you have, what we learned this morning about tzedakah tatzil mimavet and how important the Masechet ends with how important tzedakah is. And then we have this last story, which happens specifically in a wealthy person's house, right? And we're comparing the wealthy, the poor, the ones who need. And already earlier in today's shir, I discussed more about the story of tzedakah tatzil mimavet and how important tzedakah was and how they were ignoring, right? They had the walls that were blocking them from seeing what goes on outside. That's one theme. Another theme that I thought came up a lot here was finding solutions. Everything we discussed today is about finding a solution. The woman made a vow and the husband wants to get her out of it. By the way, I also think that the idea of him canceling her vows was to protect her, right? That if she swore to do something that was not in her interest, he could protect her. I think the idea was that the men maybe knew more than the women and we were able to protect them from things that they might make a mistake. I think also women sometimes say things, and there's the idea they're not so careful about it and they just, without really thinking, they might say something. And that's the idea. Again, back in their society, obviously today, I would think it might be quite different. Then we had the situation where they wanted to prevent Tuma. They wanted to find a solution. So it's not everything was going to become Tameh. So we see that there's attempts to find solutions to problems. But the real thing I wanted to focus on is this last story. Notice the idea here is all about midivrehem lamadnu, that we want to learn from their actions. And we saw all throughout the Masechet about people learning from people's actions. And you see here two stories. One is they saw this action they did with the impurity and they learned from the action. The next story was almost the opposite. You have someone doing something in the exilarch's house, which is a big public space. There's a lot of people there. And here's this rabbi, and he's doing something that looks like it's not correct. And Ula says to him, what are you doing? And I read a commentary also that said that maybe he wouldn't have asked him if he was in his house. He would have known that he must be doing it for an okay purpose. However, because he was in the exilarch's house and because there were all these people and because people might misconstrue, he had to put him and ask him, why are you doing this? And it's interesting that Rav Huna wasn't really concerned about that. And I was thinking, we learned a lot of things in the Masechet about Marit Ayin. People might think and what they, and there's always this tension between what you're worried people might think. On the other hand, you should have the confidence that you're doing the right thing and you shouldn't always worry about what other people are saying. And I think that there's this tension here, and that's the tension they're describing at the end of the Masechet about what you do and how it affects other people. And it might depend on the scenario where you are. And that's why we're told he's in the Reish Galuta's house. You might think that's a non-important detail, but it's very important because where you are, who's around you, who you are. If you're a prominent person, you might have to hold yourself in a different way and act in a different way and hold yourself to a different standard. So all these things, I think, show you, and that's why I like that the Masechet ends with this, is that we all want to know answers. We want to know, how do you do this? I don't know, for many of you who are new to this, I don't know what you expected to find in Gemara. But the Gemara essentially is a book of laws, and you'd expect to find laws and know what to do. And many of you, I'm sure, are struggling with, okay, I learned all of Masechet Shabbat. I still don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And the idea is that a lot of the laws are unclear, and it depends on the scenario, and it depends on the situation, depends on who you are, and that's the beauty of the learning, is that there's no clear-cut answers, which sometimes is a frustration. On the other hand, it shows the beauty of the system and how there's always room for other ideas. Okay, for subjectivity, for, if you remember, we learned with muktzah and all sorts of things. If you consider it important, it becomes important, and that's how the Masechet ends. With that, we're going to say the Hadrans, and then we're going to move on to the second part of the program. Hadran alach mishich uslika la Masechet Shabbat. Here we're going to say, I hope you have it all in front of you. Hadran alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadra chalan, datan alach Masechet Shabbat b'data chalan, lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo titnashe milan, lo ma'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate. We're going to say this 3 times. This means we want to go back to Masechet Shabbat. We're going to read it again. Okay, you have 7.5 years. We can go back to it. It's always going to be in our minds, and we're never going to forget you. Hadran alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadra chalan, datan alach Masechet Shabbat v'data chalan, lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo tinashe milan, lo ba'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadra chalan, datan alach Masechet Shabbat v'data chalan, lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo tinashe milan, lo ba'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yehi ratzon b'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei Avotenu shetehei toratcha u'manutenu ba'olam hazeh. Teimanu la'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa Rami bar Papa Nachman bar Papa Achai bar Papa Abba Mary bar Papa Rafram bar Papa Rachish bar Papa Surcha bar Papa Ada bar Papa Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratecha befinu u'fi piyot amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh kulanu anachnu v'tzetzeinu v'tzetzei amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei toratecha. Me'ovai techachmenu mitzvotecha ki la'olam hili. Yehi libi b'tamim b'chukecha leman lo evosh leman lo ashkach pikudecha ki bam chiyitanu. Baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha. Amen, amen, amen. Sela va'ed. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Elohai kashem she'azartani l'sayem Masechet Shabbat kein ta'azurenu lahatchil mesachtot isfarim acharim l'saymam ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו שלא ימוש התורה מפי זרענו וזרע זרענו עד עולם. ותתקיים בנו ותהלכך תנחה אותך בשופרך תשמור עליך והקיצות היא תשיחך. כי בירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, Adonai oz la'amo yiten, Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom. Okay, we're now going to introduce the first of our community speakers. We have women all around the world learning now, taken upon themselves to learn, and we have communities of women all around communicating with each other. And it's my pleasure to introduce Erica Schwartz. She's a mother of 5, former writer for the Wall Street Journal, and Jewish Week columnist, now working on a novel. So with no further ado, Erica.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. The passage that I have chosen to discuss can be found on Daf 127 Amud Aleph. It's a discussion of the Mishnah from the previous Daf that on Shabbat, one is permitted to move 4 or 5 baskets of straw. The Mishnah says, Mipnei ha'orchim u'mipnei bitul beit hamidrash, due to the guests and in order to make room for students in the study hall. The rabbis discuss the particulars of how they should be moved, who should move them, how many can be moved, all the steps that should be taken in both of these circumstances to move and handle something that would otherwise be considered muktzah. The Gemara then goes on and teaches us 3 inferences we may derive from these exceptions, each of which builds on the one before. Rabbi Yochanan tells us that what he learns is inviting guests is as important as going to the Beit Midrash early, because it says mipnei ha'orchim u'mipnei bitul Beit HaMidrash. They're on the same level. Rav Dimi takes it a step further. Inviting guests is actually greater than going to the Beit Midrash. Why? Because the Mishnah mentions the case of the Orchim first. And finally, while they're on the subject of guests, Rabbi Yehuda quotes Rav as saying that inviting guests is not only greater than the study hall, but it's actually greater than encountering God, greater than Kabbalat Pnei Hashchina. He brings his proof from the story of Abraham, who asked God to wait for him while he went to go greet the angels, or what he thought were only 3 random, travelers. God is unlike other human beings. He is not offended by our going to greet people before him. In fact, it seems by the story of Abraham that he prefers it. These comparisons and expressions of importance about the mitzvah of hospitality resonated with me, and in many ways captures what I love so much about Daf Yomi. The Gemara is teaching us that hospitality, personal connection, is so intricately tied to our ritual observance and learning. Learning in the Beit Midrash is not as fulfilling when we are unaccompanied, when we are alone. More than that, hospitality, the act of inviting people into our lives, inspires our learning. I met Michelle through the hospitality of her cousins. I don't think I'd be here finishing Masechet Shabbat were it not for that greeting and introduction. The Gemara is telling us quite directly that clearing away space in our lives for others to come close, making room for others in our life, makes us better learners and better people. This message resonates with me today more than ever before. Never has the value of hospitality felt as great as it has over these past 5 months, during which it has been so absent from our lives. We have been unable to bring guests into our homes in the way we know. We are unable to clear away a bundle next to us for a stranger, or have a bundle moved away for us ourselves. Zoom is great, as we can see in this. We're all finding new ways to connect, but it's not the same thing as opening our home, opening our study halls, sitting at Shabbos tables with others, and learning from others. It seems to me that this passage understands that, and it understands that we need relationships and exposure to new people, outreach from other people in order to be inspired. Much later in the Masechet, just a few dapim ago, this theme of guests reappeared when we learned about, changing and editing guest lists and invitation lists and menus, all the minutia of entertaining that we're longing for today. The rabbis clearly understood how hospitality is so central to Shabbat and central to our lives. What I loved about this daf in many ways represents what I love about Daf Yomi in general. For starters, Daf Yomi is itself a response to a hospitable welcome from others, from Michelle, Shoshana, the whole Hadran community, from a few friends who convinced me to start or joined in with me, from our KJ Ladies Who Daf community and the wider KJ Daf Yomi circle. Daf Yomi has literally and figuratively invited me into its home, and it is a home that so beautifully crosses gender lines, denomination lines, and of course, oceans. Through its hospitality, it inspires us all. But on a deeper level, this daf embodies exactly the structure I find so inspiring. In most of life, we look at the big picture first, and then we hone in on the details. The Talmud takes the reverse approach. Let us dive into particulars. Let us analyze each and every angle of what sometimes feels irrelevant, unimaginable, far-fetched, and too microscopic. And then let us extract a meaningful lesson to take away with us. Brachot was filled with these pieces of Agarta, Shabbat a little less so, and I am sure I will find various levels of halacha versus Agarta as we continue through the Masechtot. But like a good novel in which we each might relate best to a certain character, I enjoy plugging through what sometimes feels like weeds and arriving at a poignant message. The lessons somehow retroactively turn those weeds into something quite beautiful. I will always remember the details of moving bundles of straw in a field, because for me, they will always be a reminder of the importance of Hachnasat Orachim. I'd like to end with a final word about Elliot Freilich, in whose memory this Masechet was dedicated by myself and another woman who's on this, Tikva Jacobs, and her family. Elliot passed away way too soon. On February 23rd, 2020, at the very moment Michelle was teaching the daf to a room full of us on the Upper East Side in Tikva's apartment. February 23rd was also the beginning of the COVID pandemic directly in our lives and the breakdown of our social order and community life as we knew it. Like Avraham, Elliot is remembered for sitting outside the tent quite literally on his porch in Atlantic Beach, greeting people. This was where he could be found every Shabbat of the summer, welcoming friends, their kids, anyone who passed by to come have a l'chaim or a shmooze. But Masechet Shabbat has another fitting message for Elliot's life. As we studied the last few pages of this Masechet and we learned about the death of the truly righteous, the legacies left behind by those who conduct themselves modestly, piously, and with such goodness, we all could feel that this was Elliot. It is my prayer that in the completion of Masechet Shabbat and the start of a new tractate, God continues to bless Elliot's beautiful and hospitable neshama that we learned a few days ago still hovers over us and visits us, no pun intended, during this year of his passing. And I pray that his legacy will continue to be a source of strength, healing, and blessing to his wife, his children, his family, and all of us for many years to come. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Erica. I'm now going to introduce Shira Krebs, who lives in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, with her 4 children and her husband. She started learning Talmud at Maimonides School in Brookline, Massachusetts. Shira.
Thank you. It's an honor to be speaking among this learned group of women. My name is Shira, and I live in Minnesota, but originally hail from Boston. This is my second time through the Daf Yomi cycle, and I'm fortunate to be surrounded by an active group of fellow learners in my shul, Darchei Noam, and from the broader Jewish community of the Twin Cities. After discussing the prohibition of writing on Shabbat and then various midrashim related to how the letters were inscribed on the tablets containing the 10 Commandments, the Gemara delves into specific midrashim related to the letters themselves. On Daf 104a, the Gemara tells a story of young students who once came to the study hall and taught about the Aleph Bet. The first 2 letters, Aleph and Bet, represent Elaf Binah, learn Elaf, the wisdom, Binah of the Torah. This Agada continues with further wordplays on the Aleph Bet in a homiletical style. Be eager to bestow aid while retaining the dignity of one who is needed. If we follow God, he will sustain us, protect us, and provide for us both in this world and the world to come. The Torah contains both revealed and concealed or esoteric concepts. The importance of humility and staying on the straight path. Knowing when to lead and when to step back. When to speak and when to stay silent. Distancing oneself from falsehood and embracing truth, and so on. All derived from different pairings of the letters. Many commentators explained that these wordplays were used to teach children the shapes, sounds, and order of the letters while teaching them the basic tenets of Judaism. But there's a deeper lesson in this wordplay. The Aleph Bet supplies the building blocks of our interpretive tradition. 63 Masechtot, 2,700 double-sided pages, about 1.8 million words, all composed of merely 22 letters. Through these simple building blocks, the rabbis fashioned lessons and insights, some remarkably mundane, others breathtakingly incisive. And through these simple building blocks, we breathe life anew into that tradition daily. We construct our own novel insights. There are Shivim Panim La Torah, 70 faces to the Torah, a world of infinite possibilities of interpretation. For good reason, the act of writing these letters as the most basic word is considered a malacha, a creative act prohibited on Shabbat. Through words, God created the world. Through the words we read and grapple with daily when learning Daf Yomi, we recreate God's world. And with every time, with every cycle of the Daf Yomi, we generate new interpretations and recreate the world, all from a handful of simple shapes. And we create a richer world of interpretation when we learn as part of a community. The first time I learned Daf Yomi, I did so mostly on my own, listening to many different podcasts. Only midway through did I discover Rabbanit Farber Shiur, and did I realize that I could be part of a larger community. And as our community becomes more diverse, so does the range of interpretations. Our Hadran Women of Minneapolis group includes both men and women, Native Minnesotans and transplants, and Jews who identify with all streams of Judaism. Each reworks the building blocks in unique ways that reflect their experiences and perspectives. And I am a different person too when I learn as part of such a diverse group and approach the text afresh. It is significant that in our Gemara, it is young children who play with the Aleph Bet and arrive at insights that, according to the text, were truly novel, never having been taught since the days of Yoshua ben Nun. Through Daf Yomi and through the outreach of Hadran, more people with diverse backgrounds are learning, and more voices are entering into the tradition. As a result, we are truly able to, as Ben Bagbag says in Pirkei Avot, hafoch ba v'hafoch ba d'chole ba, turn it over and turn it over, for all is therein. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shira. I'm now going to invite Yafit Fishbach-Rosen to speak. She was born and raised in Brooklyn. She's actually the power behind the Brooklyn group, which unfortunately she just moved to Memphis, Tennessee, which is amazing for her. Sure, the group will miss you terribly. She moved there with her husband and her dog. And she's a high school English teacher and likes reading and analyzing complicated texts. So learning Daf actually makes a lot of sense for her.
Hi, thank you for having me and inviting me to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of intentionality, because that's the thing that stood out to me as a common thread throughout pretty much every discussion that we've had so far. So of course, there are instances where we learn straight up, this is allowed, this is not allowed. But more often than I would have assumed before starting to learn Daf Yomi, we learn to factor in the idea of intent before we say whether something is allowed or not. So I just wanted to review a couple of great examples of intent that we learned about in Masechet Shabbat. So firstly, the entire concept of a davar she'eino mekavin centers around the idea of intent. So for example, let's say you want to wash your hands outside on the grass, right? Watering grass on Shabbat is obviously forbidden. That's a davar she'eino mekavin. It's an unintended consequence. And Rabbi Shimon says that that's actually permitted. You're doing the same thing, watering the grass, right? Whether you do it over your hands or like this by itself, but one is permitted and one is not. So intent plays a very big factor there. And not all cases of intent fall under that category though, because sometimes it's not unintended. For example, on Daf Hey, there's a braita about throwing a ball on Shabbat. I'm sure many of you remember this one. It says that if the catcher caught the ball without moving, then the thrower is liable. But if he had to move to catch the ball, then the thrower is not liable. So if the intent was to throw the ball to one person or one place and it went somewhere else, then you might not be fulfilling your intent and therefore you might not be liable. So intent plays a very big role in that. Additionally, which Michelle just spoke about a little bit before, the entire concept of muktzah and designating something for use beforehand is an example of how important intent is in halacha, because muktzah is somewhat subjective, but some people say that you have to designate something verbally or mentally and set an intent for an item. So just the fact that you can set an intent for an item and it'll change whether that thing is muktzah or not muktzah is major. And lastly, because this story always sticks out in my head for some reason, I wanted to mention how even the intent of others matters. So for example, on Daf Kuf Chaf Bet, there's a story about Shmuel and how a non-Jew lit a lamp near him and he turned away because he didn't want to benefit from the light on Shabbat, obviously. But then he realizes that the non-Jew takes out a document to sit and read it. And he realizes that the intent of that person was to turn it on for himself. And so he turned back around and it was all okay. So all of these examples, I just wanted to bring up to just show you how all kinds of intent matters. Your own intent, another person's intent for you, and even unintended consequences of your actions. So the reason I chose to speak about this is because I think very often many of us, and I did before I started learning Daf Yomi, think that halacha is very black and white, right? This is allowed, this isn't allowed. But learning the Talmud and reading through the discussions of the rabbis makes it obvious that not everything is, this is allowed, this is not allowed. It's not all that clear cut. And there is often room for subjectivity and there's room for understanding of human nature and there's room for intent to play a role in halacha. And that's been a huge key takeaway for me in learning Daf Yomi. And the importance of intention makes everything like a little bit more human and a little bit less detached from reality when we're going on a few pages about something that seems so minute and will never happen to us. I think it makes all of this a little bit more grounded and a little bit more understandable. So that was a huge takeaway for me. And congratulations to everyone who made it to the end of Masechet Shabbat. And I hope to see you all at the Siyum for Eruvin.
Thank you very much, Yafi. We're now going to introduce Adina Hagegi. We're going to finish up with Adina from the communities. And from there, we're going to move on to the intro to Eruvim from Anne and Yardana from Talking Talmud. Adina is from Zichron Yaakov, where she raised her 5 children and a dog. She made Aliyah 32 years ago. Like this, she quickly had to learn about Israel, Sephardic culture, and how to speak French with her about-to-be husband, Eric. She's worked over 3 decades in high tech in Israel. Adina.
Thank you. I was introduced to Talmudic study 40 years ago when an ambitious young teacher named Rabbi Stanley Shmuel Peerless decided to share his love of Talmud with a religiously varied group of 10th graders in Dayton, Ohio. He chose to teach us a sugya, a topic, rather than teaching a whole Masechet. Together, we studied the intricacies of opening a refrigerator door on Shabbat. He taught us about Psik Reisha and Psik Reisha de lo Nichale, and introduced us to principles like Davar she'eino mitkaven, that we just heard about, and Melacha she'eina tzricha legufa. Long after I forgot the details, I still remembered those phrases. Over the years, I occasionally, very infrequently, studied some Gemara. Fast forward 40 years to when Hadran started publicizing the Siyum Shas for women this past January. I knew this was to be a historic moment. So despite the horrible rain, I drove down from our home in Zichron Yaakov with a friend and a daughter, and we were blown away, overcome with emotion at the euphoria, the learning, the show. Right then, I knew I wanted to reacquaint myself with Gemara and embarked immediately on the daf, first listening to the podcast and later, thanks to COVID, participating in the 7 a.m. shiur. It is a perfect way to start every day. There are so many things that I wanted to talk about in Masechet Shabbat. I'm struck by the quirky logic and the analytic calisthenics that we encounter on some dapim. I remember the story of the fig on Daf Tzadik Aleph, with a detailed debate about what happens to a dried fig that is initially small enough to not be consequential, but then expands in size and becomes significant. I also am intrigued by the focused attention that Moraim seem to have on compromise and on pragmatism. The principle of kol makom she'ata motze shnayim chalukim ve'echad machriya, halacha k'divrei ha'machriya. If you have two sages who disagree, but a third sage adopts a compromised opinion, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of the compromise. But most personal for me was when we hit Daf Lamed, page 30, and I heard the story that I'd heard all those years ago. Through the decades and over my life's experiences, the Talmudic debate remained intransient. The debate of whether one is permitted to cause a lamp to be extinguished to allow a sick person to sleep continued in the Hadran Daf Yomi shiur. We learned, She'ul she'ela zo le'ela, Rav Tanchum min Nevi. Mahu lechabot botzina dinura mikame bi'isha b'shabta. Following a debate as to whether one may extinguish a candle for the sick person, they turned to Rabbi Tanchum of Nevi and asked, can one extinguish that burning light? Rabbi Tanchum darshans at length over 2 pages and finally shares the answer. Ulinyan she'ela desha'alni kadamechun, ner kruya ner, v'nishmato shel adam kruya ner. Mutav tichbe ner shel basar adam, mipnei nero shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A lamp in Hebrew is called a candle, a ner, and a person's soul is also called a ner, as it says in Mishlei. And so Rabbi Tanchum decrees that it's preferable that the lamp belonging to human, that is the actual candle, should be extinguished to save the lamp belonging to Hashem, that is the person's soul. When I re-encountered the story, I was reminded of what Yehuda Avner, of blessed memory, tells in his book, The Prime Ministers, about his encounter with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe explained his life's mission to Yehuda Avner. You open a cupboard and you see there is a candle, but I tell you it is not a candle. It's just a lump of wax with a piece of string inside. When does the wax and the wick become a candle? When one brings a flame to the wick. That is when the wax and the wick fulfill the purpose for which they were created. And that is what I try to do, said the Rebbe, to help every man and woman fulfill the purpose for which they created. To me, the mission of Hadran is no less than that. It is honoring the candle that is at our soul, enabling us to fulfill the purpose of women and men, learning so broadly, so boldly, and with such passion. We are lucky to be able to support Rabbanit Michelle Farber and the amazing women of Hadran in dedicating the learning of the next Masechet in honor of our parents, Roger and Katy Ajej, and Rabbi Dov and Elaine Greenstone, who have inspired generations of learners committed to Daf Yomi, including Amy Fred, Shmuel Michal Samar, Akiva Samar, Rivka and Sruli Greenstone Rosenblum, Tzvima Pilachowski, Chanoch Zellinger, Yehuda Buanish, and Chanoch Sharovit. Thank you and good luck to us all as we start Eruvin.
Thank you very much, Adina. I now have the honor to introduce 2 amazing women, Ann Gordon and Yardena Osband, who are the co-hosts of the Daily Daf Yomi podcast, Talking Talmud, which does what I can't do as much, which is go in depth into the daf. And if you haven't yet listened, I recommend listening on a daily basis. They're excellent. Yardena Osband, MD, is an assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at New York Medical College in Valhalla, New York. She's also a native of Boston and lectures on Tanakh, Halakha, and Talmud with a specific interest in the biographies of the Tanaim. Ann Gordon is the deputy editor of Ops and Blogs at the Times of Israel. She's a co-founder of Chokhmat Nashim. She's a native of Boston, also a veteran educator. We actually learned together many years ago in Midrashet Lindenbaum in their scholars program. And she's taught Judaic studies in the US and Israel for nearly 30 years. Ann, in your day now.
First, Michelle, let us thank you for having us here. We have been so gratified to become part of this larger enterprise, meaning both the expansion that it takes to our own Talking Talmud podcast, which is, I would say, a conversation about something on the daf, as compared to what you do, which is go through the entirety of the daf. So that's our goal, right? To springboard off of what you've done and to allow people who haven't seen the daf to gain from the conversation, and also to allow those who have delved into the daf quite deeply to also, have something further to discuss. Okay, Masechet Eruvin. So I keep saying how exciting it is that we have come this far. Brachot, Shabbat, these have been tough months for all of us, and the daf has kind of accompanied us through them. And it feels like, okay, we're on to something new. And on the one hand, that's very exciting. And then I'm reminded of a what I think is truly a wise statement from an old friend of mine who would say, I said to him once, when you get to the new sugya, how do you feel? What do you do? He says, I wish I were back in the old sugya, because we're about to embark on a largely new vocabulary, largely new concepts. We have a little bit of an edge up because Eruvin kind of continues from Shabbat in that we've already done our talking about domains and carrying and so on, but it's still a very different animal. And it's going to require a different kind of mindset, I think. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the end, about how to prepare ourselves to go into this, to make the most of our daf learning. I want to say, and Yardain will speak about this a little bit more, Masechet Eruvin kind of falls between things. We know that there is an Isur Doraita of carrying, Mirashut Lirashut, and that is Mirashut Hayachid Lirashut HaRabim. That means that we have definitions that are Doraita of what is a Rishut HaRabim, what is the public domain, and we have a definition of what is a Rishut HaYachid. And the difference begins with, is it a privately owned? Is there a roof over it? Do 600,000 people traverse that area every day, right? There's a whole lot of discussion over what makes something a Rishut Yachid and what makes something a Rishut Rabim. But at the end of the day, those are clearly defined or fuzzily defined, and then we come to a conclusion of clearly defined spaces. And then the question is, what happens in all that space in between your very private domain and your very public domain? And that is where Masechet Eruvin falls. And it is exactly that kind of definition of space that is undefined, that is, an ambiguous zone that Masechet Eruvin comes to teach us what we can do and how we are sometimes allowed to carry if we make the Eruv in the proper way, and when we cannot, and there's no option for an Eruv to begin with. I just want to note that the idea of carrying as a prohibition or as something to be done, and then therefore comes to be a prohibition, is found in the Torah also. And that's where we get this Rishut Yachid, Rishut Rabim distinction, right? The first source is really about when Bnei Israel were told not to go out and collect the man on Shabbat, that they would have a double portion on Friday, so that they would not go out to bring into their homes from the public to the private. And then we were also told that that everybody would contribute to the Mishkan. And this is where the Malacha of Hotza'ah has its place in the Mishkan. People would take from their private stash of jewelry, of gold, whatever they might have, to contribute to the Mishkan. And that's all well and good, but not on Shabbat. That would be taking from the private to the public. So again, there's our very clearly defined terminology, terms, domains, and enterprise. And that's actually not the domain of Masechet Eruvin. Yardena.
Hi, thank you so much. And again, we're really thrilled to be here and hope that we'll be learning alongside many of you. So, when Ann and I were thinking about how we wanted to introduce Masechet Eruvin, so on the one hand, it's sort of, it really, and some people actually feel that it's a continuation of Masechet Shabbat, and that it probably may have been at one time one large Masechet that was sort of split into two. And I think today we just wanted to go over a couple of basic concepts and then conclude with a couple of ideas and strategies that we have for how to maybe go ahead and approach this. The sort of, I don't want to say bad news is, when we think about the different masechtot that there are to learn, classically there are sort of three that are considered to be, they have the acronym ANI, right, like a poor person, that are considered to be the three hardest ones. And it's Eruvin, Nedarim, and Yevamos. But once we get through it, I think after all the Agadata that we did in Brachot, which I think is a beautiful way to start our learning of Daf Yomi, Masechet Shabbat is sort of a little bit more of a combination of the two. And I think the challenge and the great piece of Eruvin is that it's really going to be a much more type of immersive halachic experience. But I think that's also great, and that I think we'll really all grow and learn a lot and push ourselves maybe in ways that some of us have not learned before. So where does the concept of Eruv come from, and what does the word mean? So literally the word means like mixing, some type of mixture. Some people say that it maybe comes from the idea of like mixing the permissible with the non-permissible. I don't think we can think of the word Eruv without thinking about the phrase of Kol Yisrael Arevin Ze Lazeh, right? That we are all dependent upon each other. And that essentially what establishing an Eruv does is, and there are different types of errors, which I'll go through in a minute, is it's extending different types of boundaries. But what it also does is, particularly with the Heir of Tahum, which I'll speak about in a second, is it's actually a mixing of people. It's when people come together and they say, we're going to extend our Reshut HaYachid together. And I think in a way, that's where the Kol Yisrael Arevin Ze Lazeh comes to. What's also interesting about Masechet Shabbat, unlike where we saw, Masechet Eruvin, unlike what we saw in Masechet Shabbat, where very often there would be a question, what's the source for this halacha? Where did we learn this? Really, Masechet Eruvin is a Masechet of rabbinic law. And it's taking rabbinic law that sort of really limited the ability to carry, right? We know that the Reshut HaRabim, the Reshut HaYachid, that has a Deoraisa, that has a Torah source. The Carmelite is more of a has more of a rabbinic source. And then basically what's happening here is the rabbis are basically saying, okay, now that we've had this limitation of Hotzah, what are the things that we can do to make it a little bit different for people in a way that's a little bit easier for people? And I think that's one of the challenges with Eruvin, is we're not going to see a lot of Mishnah or Gemara speak about like, what is the source for this? In fact, the really only source that we have for this is on Daf Chaf Aleph, just in passing. They mentioned that, the source for Error of Tafshilin is from Shlomo HaMelech, that he established it, but it doesn't really say how, or is there a pasuk, or what made him establish it. It's really just sort of mentioned in passing. So I think all of that is very interesting. And I think one of the things that people get frustrated about with Masechet Eruvin is that in a way it seems like it's a figment of the rabbinic imagination, right? Like this was a bunch of boundaries or barriers literally that were created. And now we're going to figure out different types of barriers and boundaries to create rabbinically to allow certain types of behaviors on Shabbat. And so I think this really serves us valuably as a masechet that really shows us the rabbinic, what I really would want to call the rabbinic imagination, and the stretching of what the rabbis were able to do with halacha. And I can't remember who it was, but somebody mentioned before, I think it was, the idea that I think we do see sort of a tension that we saw in Masechet Shabbat as sort of like people being able to keep parts of Shabbat, and they're also sometimes being concerned of people not being able to keep parts of Shabbat. And so really what's happening in Masechet Eruvin is the rabbis coming and saying, look, not being able to carry or not being able to travel a certain amount is difficult. And so what are the ways that we can stretch that and make that happen? So let's just go over a very quick couple of vocabulary. What are the different types of errors? And then Ann and I will wrap up with some strategies. So there's the Heir of Tahum, which I just mentioned, which is essentially taking a multitude of private domains or even a Carmelite, and then sort of linking them together by different boundaries. And you'll see this already in the first parak, which could be using a lechi or a korah, which are different types of either a post or a beam, a cross beam that goes across, and then sort of making everything a reshus hayachid. A subcategory of that would be the shituf mavaot, which is taking an alleyway, which is not technically a real reshut hayachid, but somehow linking that as well. The other type is we have this Heir of Tahum, which essentially, if many of you know, is that we're not allowed to travel more than 2,000 amot, out of your resident where you live on Shabbat. And essentially by leaving food at the end of that boundary, and sort of making another residence for yourself, you can extend that boundary by another 2,000. The last one that many of you are probably the most familiar of in terms of actually doing is the Error of Tafshilin. That's actually not dealt with in Masechet Eruvin, but I did want to just mention it. That's really a halacha of Yom Tov and is going to be dealt with totally separately. So really what we're going to be dealing with is essentially the Erev Chatzerot and the Shituf Mavaod, which is really sort of one category, and the Erev Tahumim. So strategies. How do we think, Anne and I were talking a lot about how to go about this. So one is that I think there's actually like a lot of vocabulary in this Masechet. And I know that for particularly the system of how a lot of people learn Daf Yomi, I think everybody has like their real routine. This is the podcast I listen to. This is the person I listen to. I do this when I walk. I do this, whatever. I do this when I drive to work. For those of us who are still going to work, we have like a real routine around this. What I'm really going to ask of people to do is push yourselves a little bit. This is the time to have a notebook. I'm a huge note writer. And this is really a time to you want to actually be very deliberate. And one of the things Anne and I plan to do on Talking Talmud, we do a thing called Who's Who, What. We're going to be doing a lot of vocabulary and really keeping a list of yourself of new terms that you have not heard of before. The other thing that I would say, and then I'll hand it over to Anne again, is this is a very visual masechet. And I think that's really what the challenge is, because you're reading in words something that you have to see. For me personally, this is a huge challenge. I'm not a visual person. I'm a terrible artist. And we personally haven't actually found one particular Gemara or one particular Sefer that has like all the drawings in one place that are the best way to learn it. This is a project for somebody to do, something that us and Hadran have actually been talking about. But I would really encourage, for those of you who are visual, make a sketch of what you're reading about, share it with your Hadran group, share it on the Talking Talmud Facebook page. Maybe this is something that's going to come out now that we see that there's been sort of this democratization of learning Talmud. I think there's this fabulous opportunity. There's hundreds of us on. There's got to be a few of us who are amazing artists. Use your visual skill. But for everyone personally, I think you want to sort of be sketching things out. And the third thing is that because I think there isn't necessarily one resource, I think I would also encourage everybody, you may end up using a few sources. You may end up liking the Koran with the art scroll. Maybe before you only liked one. There may be, you're going to listen to Rabbanit Michelle, but then you may find that, you're going to need to be using some more visual tools as well. And so I think, to allow yourself, at least for Masechet Eruvin, maybe a little bit more time than what you normally give yourself to a daf, because I think that's really going to be key in order to make this successful. So before I hand it over to Anne, again, we want to thank Hadran and Rabbanit Michelle Farber for hosting us on your website, for having many of the same learners. We hope to see many of you back here again to celebrate our completion of Masechet Eruvin together. And really, b'hatzlacha, I think this is going to be a great, challenging new start of all of our journey in Daf Yomi together.
Thanks, Yardena. I just want to pick up on what you've said and say, I think that perhaps the single best tool in embarking on this Masechet is to know who you are, to know yourself as a learner. And are you a visual thinker? Are you not a visual thinker? What tools will you need? Will you be served best by taking that extra few minutes and sketching out the domain itself for yourself, or to look it up, or to not even bother with it and accept that maybe you won't be able to visualize it and you'll move on and just learn the halacha about it, right? Meaning, I think that who you are, knowing yourself, who you each and every one of us is as a learner is key to success in learning Eruvin in particular. I think the same might be true for Yavamot, where there's a lot of charts as well. And I think that with that, I will wish us all a good Siyum and a good luck in the coming weeks, months of Masechet Eruvin. We know it's going to be a challenge. They say, and it's a challenge to all of us, they say that more people drop out at the point of Eruvin than perhaps at any other point, because if you can make it through Eruvin, you can keep going. So let's take that as a challenge and an encouragement.
Thank you very much, Anna and Yardena. I'd like to also encourage everyone. What I've learned in Daf Yomi, it's actually interesting that you mentioned the 3 hardest ones. My hardest one was Shkalim. I still remember it. It's only 21 days, which is good, but sometimes people intimidate you into thinking things are hard. And actually, when you go through the day to day, it's really not so hard. And I think when you get into the rhythm, you just keep going, and then you learn that you can deal with any challenge that comes your way. I want to thank everybody for joining us here tonight. Because I'm a person who likes statistics, I want to just give you a perspective here of the statistics for tonight. 690 people registered for the event. 600 completed Masechet Shabbat before tonight. 40, or together with us tonight, 40 are almost there. 27 are occasional learners, and 20 said they were just coming to support and to celebrate. So with that, I want to look forward to sharing with many, many more Siyums with all of you together. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of the learning. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Remember that everybody's important, and everybody's commentary and comments and questions and memes and everything that's going on right now is all really thanks to all of you, and keep being active and asking and commenting. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Michelle, can I just add
Yes.
before everyone leaves, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, be as active as you want in sharing any of our content. And recently we've been seeing many of you joining the communities. We welcome you all to be active and introduce yourselves into your communities, into your local communities. It has a really positive effect on most people's learning, so we highly recommend that. And congratulations to everyone finishing.
I want to add that everyone should also feel to pop on the Zoom whenever they want. If you're up late one night in New York and you want to hop on the Zoom, it's at 7:10 in the morning, and there's time for conversation after class. And it's really fun to be having a conversation with people and being involved in a more active way together with everybody. So feel free to come on the Zoom whenever it works for you. The link's on our site, so please come.
And meeting.
Thank you, everyone.